Assalamu alaikum. Today is day 19 of PHP in DDCDP23 and part 9 of the MVC framework in PHP which we have been building. The topics today are events or hooks. Drupal calls them hooks, but generally in MVC frameworks in PHP and even other technologies, they are called events. Then there are event dispatches which actually um dispatch the events. Then there are listeners which listen to particular events on the site, and then the service providers which feed the event dispatches. So there's a lot to cover, and all of these topics are very interesting. And since in any major frameworks you will encounter these, it's very important to cover this topic. So let's start with the small bug in our application from the last lecture. If we go to, for example, student/new, so we are getting up an error, and that is the middlewares related to the middlewares property we were assigning in the kernel.php. So if you go to this line in our code, it basically means that if this array is empty and this array is coming, you can go back to the previous lecture. This is coming from all this code. So if this is empty, it should not be assigned to this variable in the request handler. So what we can do is we can enclose it in if empty this only when this array is not empty, then it should be assigned to this. So hopefully this will fix the error we have. Got it? And better would have been if we in the request handler we created a setter method, and there we can also use if statement, but for now this is okay. So if I refresh the page, hopefully this error will be gone and we will be able to access the form. Okay, so now we are into the topic of the day, and that is events. In Drupal they are called hooks also, and then now they also are called events in the newer versions. So what actually events are? So for example, if I submit this form, I want some email to be sent or some other functionality to be carried out, right? So the actual code where all of this is happening is, for example, this is a framework, and where it is in entity controllers process method, this. Okay, so for example, this is your Symfony code or Laravel code or whatever, and this saves your data in the database. So you have been asked to send an email once the record is submitted. So you won't do this inside this process method. You will be polluting the actual code. So for example, this is the code, and if I want you to send an email, so you will go to the source file, and then you will, for example, here you will send the mail, right? So this will work surely, but this is not the way to do it. Why? Because for example, just tomorrow or today the code gets updated, so your code will basically be overwritten by the update. Similarly, this is not good practice to alter or change original code of a framework, right? And then maybe this is just one functionality we want to do. Maybe you want to say do 10 different things once the user submits student data. So all of that code will then have to be written here, and that's not a good practice to do it in the source code. So what we will do for this is we will implement a system which is always there in the modern frameworks, and that is called events or event dispatchers. So let's dive in. We will start with a bit of theory, and the best place for that will be if you just search PSR 14. So they are called event dispatches. You can have a read of this document, it's not a long one. Even so, PSR 14 has some definitions of these terms: event, listener, dispatcher, and listener, provider, all of these. So an event is a message provided by an emitter. It may be any arbitrary PHP object. So just like in JavaScript you had events, so here you will have to create an event, right? Then listeners, so if that event occurs, there are listening objects for it. Similarly, dispatcher, so how do we know that a certain event has occurred? So you will have to run a dispatcher class in object. Dispatcher basically, for example, in JavaScript you click on a button, right? So this is an event, and that clicking dispatches that event actually. But here we will have to create our own dispatchers, and we will study most of these. So let's start with the code. In framework, we will create a new folder and call it event dispatcher or dispatchers. So event dispatcher. Here we need to have two interfaces. One of them is event dispatcher interface .php. So the event dispatcher class will implement this interface. If you go to that document again, so at the bottom you can see this is event dispatcher interface, and it will implement a dispatch method. And similarly, the another one is listener provider interface, but we'll need these two for now to make things easier. The first one is event dispatcher interface, so let us create it. Rather, I will just copy it. So the name of the file is interface, and it is event dispatcher interface. Here I will paste that code. I think we don't need these. So this, the class which implements this interface will have this method, public function dispatch, and what is passed to this? The object of event, right? So this is the first interface we created. So any dispatcher interface, event dispatcher for example, it will implement this interface. Clear? So now let us create that other interface, or maybe let us create the event dispatcher class first. So in the event dispatcher, we'll create a new file and we'll call it event dispatcher.php. Event dispatcher.php. So this is going to be the concrete class, and the namespace should be the same, and the class name is event dispatcher, which should implement what? This event dispatcher interface. And as soon as we use it, this is this red line, which means we need to implement the dispatch event dispatch method, sorry. So public function dispatch, and it will have the event object, right? Okay, we will go stepwise, and we will have to create two more files for now, but at the moment in the event dispatcher.php at least we have implemented the method which this interface implements. Okay. Now we have to create the event object. So for events we should have an abstract class first, so that we can extend it. All other events should extend that class. So here again in the event dispatcher we can create a class and we call it event.php. This is going to be the parent class for all the events, and here the namespace should be yes, and you can also create your own maybe event folder inside the dispatcher or inside the framework, but for now this is okay. The class name should be abstract class event, and it should implements stoppable event interface. And let me just we'll create this interface right now. So what should the event class implement? This interface, stoppable event interface. And if you go to that documentation again, this is stoppable event interface. So certain events could be stopped, the sequence of the events. So we can inside the event we can say stop. So all others, just like in the yesterday's lecture we were using authenticate to just return the response. Similarly, if we want, we can in the sequence of events listeners we can stop it so that it doesn't propagate. So we will copy this interface, stoppable event interface, let me just create the interface first, call it stoppable event interface.php, and the interface is, or maybe just copy and paste this. Okay, even there is this description with the interface. Is propagation stopped? This will typically only be used by the dispatcher to determine. So I will explain all of this. So is propagation stopped? This is going to return a boolean. So this event which we are creating, the abstract class, it implements this, right? And we can use it here, use stoppable okay. I have a question. Though we are implementing this stoppable event interface now, it has a method, but still there is no line with the class. Why? We haven't yet implemented the interface, but still there is no line. Normally if you don't implement, the editor asks you to implement that function, but now there is no line. Why? Good, because this is abstract class, and the editor assumes that certainly in any of its child classes you will have to implement this. So if we just remove the abstract here, so you can see there will be then the line, but we will implement it here. Okay, so in this event we will have three things. First, we will have to use that method which is inside the stoppable, which is propagation stopped. It returns boolean. So we will private bool is stopped. We can create a variable private bool is stopped, and it should be, for example, by default it can be false or true, whatever. Okay, so the interface method will give us like function, what's the name of it, is propagation stopped. We copy it. So public function is stopped. So what do you think it should return? What should it return? This variable. Yeah, this, whatever is the status of it, So it will be dollar sign this is top, like this, right? And we will use the return. So this is that method we wanted to. So if this is true or false, whatever, so it will return that status accordingly, right? And also we can have a function, only this public function stop propagation. So what do you think this will do, this function?
This will stop propagating
Yeah.
events.
Yeah, so what it should do in this function, it will change the status of it, whatever it is, to false.
Yes,
If in case it is true, so it will make it false. So what we should do, so this colon is stop equals false, false. Got it? So if in case we have to ever stop propagation of some events, so we can do it here via this method. But this one was from the stoppable event interface, okay, which we will have to just check. Okay, this is the event class. So any custom events we create should extend this event class, is this event, right? By default should be false. Okay, now what we have done, we have created the event class. Now let us create a some event. So for that we will go to framework, and here we will create a new folder and call events or event, whatever. So all our events should go inside the events folder, right? So for example, let me give you the same example. Maybe the first one should be just once the response is returned, about to be returned, right? So maybe we want something to do, right? So let us create a response event first. New file, response event.php, right? Events response event. So what should be the namespace? Events. And the name of the class should be response event, right? What should it extend? The event we created in the dispatcher, this one, event, right? Okay, so response event should be, where should we want this event to happen? Just before kernel sends back the response, right? It can be anything. So here we will, what we need is maybe in the constructor, public function underscore construct, we can have a promoted property of private response, $response. By now you should know what promoted properties are. It's a shortcut way of assigning the variables. And the next one should be private request and $request. And now these two need to be, so use request, so it's HTTP request, and the other one is use framework response. Clear? Okay. So the event response event has now this constructor with these two properties. Also we need to have two methods to get response and to get request in case we need it. Okay, so public function get request, what it should do, so return this dot request. And similarly we need to have response return function get response, and should return what, return this dot response, right? Also you can specify the return value, so it should return request. Sorry, and this one should return response. Is this clear? So that's all we needed to do for the response event. Okay, so basically the event class is just some information, and normally the event constructor are passed some information. So for example, do you know where we will have to run it? So if I go to the kernel and just about the return from this, actually is response, right? So here we will use this in a while. I can comment, we will use this event here. Okay, so if we are using it here, it means we can pass these two variables. Sorry, where the code is, these two variables. If I go to response event, where it is, this one, these two variables there. Okay, so wherever you need to run an event or fire an event, so the information passing to that event should be available there. That's my point actually. So you can see in the kernel both request and response are available, right? So it should be logical where you want to use those events, right? Okay, now this is clear. Okay, so what we have done so far, I will go back to the event dispatcher. We have created event class, which is an abstract class. Event implements stoppable event interface, and this actually provides this method of is propagation stopped. And we have created this stoppable event interface also. It has just this method. Okay, now we also have extended the event class we created, and for that we have created the events folder inside the framework, and here we have create the response event, and it will extend the event. But now there is a very important concept, and that is event dispatcher. We already have created the interface for it. It should have a dispatch property, this, and the event dispatcher class also we have created, but we have to add some extra functionality here. Okay, the event dispatcher, as the name suggests, it will dispatch the event. It will dispatch the event mean it will send the event. So here in the kernel, we will, as I said, I have commented it out, we will use the event here. So by itself the event won't be used, the dispatcher will run the event, issue the event actually. In JavaScript scenario, you can say that if you double click on a button, automatically the event is dispatched. But here, to mimic that functionality, for example, we will manually create this event dispatcher class, and it will send an event for us. Okay, not the double click, because this is server side language. So the dispatching means to basically inform the program that this event has taken place. In JavaScript, we need to click a button, for example. Here we need to run this code so that the program knows that this event has happened. Yeah, got it? Okay, so in the event dispatcher class, we have this method. We will do it in a while, but here we will have private iterable. What is iterable? Yeah, you can loop through something. So it should be an array of listeners. Okay, events have listeners. Do you agree?
Yes, sir.
So those listeners will be residing here, and for now let it be an empty array like this. Is this okay? Okay, then the event dispatcher interface. So this method also we already have assigned it to okay. Here this will have, let me show you what it should have. Okay, so we haven't yet assigned any listener. Okay, event is something else and listener is something else. So when an event happens, there is some code which is known as listeners, right? So let me just create a blank, or maybe, and listeners are what? Your own code. Events are provided by the framework. For example, the response event has been provided by the framework, but if you have to listen to the response event, you will have listeners, right? And listeners are your own code. So where should it go to? In the source. Should not be in the framework. In the source, you will have to create a folder and call listeners, right? And here you will create a new file and we call it response event listener. It can be anything. Okay, so or maybe, for example, what can we listen to?
Form submission.
Maybe we want to add extra headers to the response. Okay, so we will add, name the response event listener, LISTEN listener, and header response event listener.php. Maybe this is a function, right? Sorry, a class name. So here what we can do is a namespace should be app and listeners. Listen, is it okay? Listener, listen. Maybe we are giving it the wrong spellings. Listeners. Okay. Class is header response event listener. Response event listeners, we can name it any, maybe there are best practices for it, but at least this shows us that this is going to be a listener for response event.
Yes.
Right? Okay, here this event should have a public function underscore invoke. Have you studied this before?
Means calling the function.
Yeah, so what does this mean inside the, this is a magic method. You can I think we have not studied it, but what this does is, and it will be passed, it will be passed the response event object. Okay, one thing, this event is, this listener is for this response event. Okay, so in its invoke method, this object should be passed.
So the event listener happened of the listener.
Yes, so this event listener is for this event, response event, right?
Yes.
So that response event object should be passed to the invoke method.
Yes.
And we will use response method here. Response event, sorry. Right? Okay. Basically, the invoke method, what it does is it makes a class, basically the object of a class, callable. Like functions, we call functions, right? So how? For example, if I knew it, whatever is the object of this class, it is header, for example, header response equal new this class, right? This class or this. Okay, so now this object, this is just an object, right?
Yes, sir.
So the invoke method underscore invoke actually will make this object callable. So automatically now you can call this as a function. response, and you can pass the event to it, whatever it is. Normally this does not happen. Normally it is, you will have to use the arrow key on a method or whatever. But the magic method underscore underscore invoke basically makes the object of a class callable, right? This is a unique distinction to $sign invoke. So I will comment it out here. Okay, so what this will do is, this is the listener should have underscore underscore invoke method, right? And here you can you pass anything to this method, and now you can manipulate this or whatever. So if you remember what the response event was doing, response event, let me just go back to it. Events, response event. So we have in the constructor we have response this, right? And two helper methods of get request, get response. So for example, I need to change response in this method. It is passed the event, right? So how can I catch response? So the event is passed, event call get, even use get response, right? So it will give you the response equals this, right? Got it? Okay, so if in case I have to change the response here, so I will, for example, I just make the response as dummy coming from header response, right? So I can change it here. And as I said before the class, we don't need to return this. Why? Because the object passed to a function basically means that it is being passed as something by reference. So otherwise we would have to return the response. But so here if we change it, it means we have changed the response, just like yesterday's middleware. So the header response listener basically has changed this response, and that's it. Now this is just a dummy. We will have a real one after this one, but this is the response for, sorry, a listener for response event. Okay, now we'll go back to the event dispatcher class, this one. So the listeners basically will have what? It will have a key of the event, and so for example the key should be, how can I know that this event has these listeners? So they will be provided here. So for example, response response event class, it should be an array also, like this array, right? And each array should have listeners. That's how we know that these are listeners actually. So the listeners should be the classes for, so that is going to be, the first one should be this header response event list, right? Where it is, where did we go to? Here. So the first one should be header response event listener and class, like this for example. Got it? But here it should be the new of this, and if we have other listeners, we can provide those as well here. Okay, so that's why we are going to keep it empty here. We will have another mechanism, but actually the data structure of this listeners array should be like this, keyed with the name of the event and then the listeners. Got it? I will remove it for now. Okay, so what the dispatcher will do is, the dispatcher will, let us create a helper method first, and that will be public function get listeners for event. And what should be the event? Event should be the object event okay. So here the event is passed to this method, okay. So we can get the name of the class here. The object's name can be event name equals what? $event, sorry, get underscore class and event. So if a response event object is passed to it, so the response method event class should be, we can get it this way. Now it will check inside the listeners if, just like yesterday, okay, in array underscore key underscore exists. So for example, this is a response class event, this event name. So $event name and this dot listeners. If this exists, so we will return that, return this dot listeners and the name of the event name. So what this will give you, for example, this is it has the response event class, for example, so it will give all the listeners of that. Exactly, right? So one event can have more than one listener. That's why we will have to loop through it, okay. So this this can be an array. So the return value of this function should be what? Array or iterable, you can. Yes, because array and iterable means the same thing, okay. So we can now use this function get listeners for event inside this dispatch method to find the listeners for a particular event, right? So this event name is passed to it. So what we can do is, how can we access this now? Get listeners for event. This get listeners and we have to pass this event, okay. That's an event. So what will this return? Anybody? Array. Well done. So we can for each through it. For each this as what? The listener. Each one will be as listener, right? For each this, because this is an array of event, so it will give you multiple listeners. So in each iteration it will be a listener, right? So the listener will do is, so the listener will actually be, okay, so for each this dot get listeners for event as listener. So if this array has these event classes and then keyed with corresponding listeners, so we are looping to them, and here I think we have a typo as well. It should be listeners and there is an excess here. Listeners. Is this okay now? Okay, so this is also this should also, return, even if it is empty, it should return an iterable. So this Okay, so if listener has the key of some response event and then the corresponding listener, so we are looping through it, and then what should we do with the listener? What is this individual listener? For example, this is response event passed to this dispatch method, so it will get the key from listeners, and they will be more than one. For example, listeners, we are looping through them. So here we will basically run there. As I told you, underscore invoke method makes an object callable.
Yes, sir. Callable.
So here the listener is callable, and we will pass the event to it like this. Whichever event, as I said, for the listeners of a particular event, we should pass the same data where the event occurs. So for example, the response event is passed to the listener, and if I go to the response event, this is the response event, and we have created a listener for it. This is the listener. Okay, so the listener invoke is passed that particular, you can say, the parent event of a listener, or whatever the event is, it should be passed to the listener invoke method. So here that is happening now. The dispatcher, here we are passing, for example, this is now the listener and this is the event.
Yes.
We can add and rather we should add one more method to add values to the listeners. Right now we have no mechanism of adding the values to the listener. So here public function add listener. So how many values should be passed to this?
Two
Two.
value. Key value.
One should be key, and the key should be the event.
Yes.
Event name and the listener, right?
Yes.
So event name should be, for example, response event colon class, and the listener should be the object of
Object
the
of that class.
listener, right? So what it should do is this dot listeners and event name equals listener. Okay, I have a question here. First I will do it this way. If I do it this like this, so how many listeners can be there for a particular event? One. But for an event there can be more than one listener. So what should we do here? What change should we bring?
No.
If I just use it right now just like this, it will, this event name will only have one listener.
Sir, we have to add one more array.
Exactly. This is what I wanted to hear. So now this event, for example, if it is a response event, it can have more than one
Yes, sir.
listeners added, right? Okay, and we can use, what does this mean? Return this.
Parent. It will return the parent.
So
Add listener.
yeah, so what if I call this add listener method, for example, what should be the return value?
The class.
Yeah, so why are we doing it? If you remember, we had studied chaining both in JavaScript and
Yes, sir.
PHP, method chaining.
Yes, sir.
So for example, if I use add listener once and then I want to add another method also, so I can just directly add a listener again, add listener again, something like promises in JavaScript, if you remember.
Yes, sir.
We could use chaining. So I will demo it once we are there. So I think we are done with the dispatcher, the dispatcher class, event dispatcher class, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I think we are good to go to initialize the dispatcher class. This dispatcher class, it has in the constructor, it doesn't have any constructor, so probably it will be easy getting initialized via the container, right?
Yes.
So for now I will do it in index.php, but later we will create another system for it. One thing I am noticing, we have changed the name of the class but not the variable, so let us change it to kernel as well. Kernel handle request. Okay, so here we already have the container available. So if I need the dispatcher class, so what should I do? Dispatcher or event dispatcher equals what? We are not going to use new, we will use container. So if we need container, get, and it is going to be dispatcher class, right?
Yes.
And this is now our event dispatcher class. So what can we call on it? It has a dispatch method.
Dispatch method, yes, sir.
If I go to the event dispatcher again, and it has this dispatch method,
Yes, sir.
and it will be passed an object of the event, right? But this we will do in where we want the event to be sent, not in the index.php file. But here we need actually these two things, the event name
Yes, sir.
and the listener.
Listeners.
These two things. We want to add listeners to this array actually of the dispatcher. So how can we do it now? In the index page, we will change this code in a while, but for now let it be in, because we already have very populated index.php page, which should not be the norm. Okay, so event dispatcher, it should be what doing? Add listener, right?
Yes.
The key should be the
Event name.
event name. So in our case it is response event. We already have created response event,
Yes.
and colon class, right?
Yes, sir.
So it should be adding that as a use.
Yes, sir.
So response event colon class, and the second value should be
Listeners.
the listener,
Yes, sir.
but not the listener, the object of the listener. So it will be new, and the name of that is,
Header response event listener.
okay, yes, header and response.
Event listener.
So it's header response event listener, this one, and not needed, new this,
Yes, sir.
because we are sending the object, right?
Yes, sir.
So the chaining I just told you, rather than going to the second line and adding add listener again, for example, if we have another one,
Yes, sir.
so we can directly use dot arrow and add listener again,
Yes, sir.
because this returns this, the object. So we can change the add listeners. Okay,
Yes,
got
sir.
it? Okay, now this has been added, the event dispatcher has been added to the next step is, we have now this object event dispatcher, we need to pass it to the kernel.
Yes.
So the fourth parameter should be event dispatcher, right?
Yes, sir.
And in the kernel.php, where it is, this one, the handle method now should have the fourth parameter as well, sorry, the constructor. So it will be event dispatcher, right? And this should be included. So use event dispatcher
Yes.
this one, event dispatcher. Okay, it should be private as well, so to promote it, or maybe we can use it directly like this, otherwise let us do it this way. This dot, we should first create a property, private event dispatcher, right? And we will then assign this to in the constructor to this property. This is normal stuff, you should be used to it now.
Yes.
Event dispatcher, right? So now this event dispatcher is available as a property on this class, which actually is the class we need now, right?
Yes, sir.
Let us close this dump. Okay, at the bottom of the handle method, we should basically, because a lot of code is now here, we should break it into sub methods also. Maybe at the end of the class we will do it, otherwise you can do it yourself also. This code is a lot in the handle method, so we should break it into separate methods so that it is more readable. Okay, so at the bottom of the screen, this is basically the response being returned. Okay, so let me just change it into a variable. Return response, and response equals this, right? So here we can basically use, just immediately before sending the response back, we can use our response event. For that we have brought the dispatcher here. So
Dispatch.
this dot dispatcher dot dispatch, what should we pass to it? The new response event,
Yes.
new response event, right? So new response event, here you have to call it.
Yes.
And if you remember, in its constructor we have two values to pass. Remember, request,
Request and response.
request, and the second one is response. Let me just check the order. Response, maybe we have the order wrong. So if I go to the response event, if you remember, these are two. The first is response, the second is request. So let us change the order. It should be response first, because this is now the response, right?
Yes.
Response, and this one is
Request.
request. Okay,
Yes.
and now we are returning the response. So that is okay. Now the code will check in the dispatch method. If I go back to the dispatcher class, it will now check this is a dispatch. It will get the listener and call it,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So what's the listener of this class? It is this header response, this. Okay,
Yes.
so if you remember, it is past the response event, so we have passed that.
Yes.
Here we are catching the response event is get response, and for now we have changed the response to dummy coming from
Yes.
header response, right?
Yes.
So if I refresh the page and if I get this, what does this mean? That the
The response has been changed.
response has been changed. So here we can do anything: email the response, save it to some other table or whatever, change it, add it. So basically, if I refresh now the page, hopefully, if things are fine, probably it hasn't worked. Okay, so probably we have some problem here in the header response event listener, and that is we have just assigned text to the response variable. Rather, it should be response set body like this, and we'll pass this text to so here we are changing the response to just this dummy text. And if we refresh the page, so now we are getting, rather than the form for student new, we are getting this dummy text in the way it has been changed by the text we have written in this. So here you can, because we have the response object, if you remember, we can add extra headers also. Set header, any header can be added here.
Yes.
Anything, so you can change it to the response to anything. and that's why we have named this event as response event, right? And Symfony calls them kernel events also. If you have to change the request or response, they are issued from the kernel class or the kernel subsystem. Okay, we can have more than one listeners to a particular so for example here I add another listener, so I will copy this class and paste so that we can easily do it, and we will call it maybe invalid word response listener. For example, we want to check for certain words in our response. Okay, let us suppose some ugly word. So if that happens, so the name of the class should be invalid response listener, word response listener, right?
Yes.
And the response is event get response, whatever. Okay, so how to register it now?
We have to add it inside the array.
Yeah,
Listener
and from
array.
where?
Inside.
It is in the index file right now. We'll change it again. Remember here. So event dispatcher add listener, and the listener is for the same
Yes, sir.
response class, right? So
Yeah.
you can change it, chain it. Sorry, like this. Add listener and the same keys,
Yes, sir.
but with a different
Different object.
object, and this should be
Invalid.
word listener,
Word response listener.
right?
Yes, sir.
And the new of it, I mean the object of it, and we will use it here as well.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so now we have added the second one. So if I go to the first one and just copy or maybe undo that code we had a while ago, this one. So dummy coming from header response, and the same if I copy this here, but first I have to get the original response also, so that I can concatenate it. Okay, so coming from the invalid word checker class, I will have to concatenate it to response dot get body dot this. Is this okay?
Yes, sir.
So it will be basically two words now.
Yes, sir.
So let me try if it is working. So now it is two words. Is this okay?
Yes, sir.
So it means you can have more than one listener, and each listener can be able to do any stuff on your side. Okay, so how to check a word? String pose PHP, or maybe string contains, find the position of the first occurrence of a substring in a string, right? So it basically, if the main string is ABC and I have to find A, so this will return a position, means either true or false. So this is used to check for words in a larger string. Okay, so what I can do is here in the invalid checker, rather than this, what we can do is we can get the response. We can get the response here. So if $sign string str pose string position, and the whole string is response, and the text to find is, for example, the text has something like what, cricket. Let it just give me example of cricket. So if cricket is in the response, right, yeah, response dot get body. If this string has cricket in it,
Yes, sir.
if this string has cricket in it, so do something else, whatever it is, right? So what should it do? If it has string, for example, I can have some other string, right? So here we can, if I copy this this one again, so if it has cricket in it, we will set body to this cricket is not allowed, for example. Otherwise I won't do anything.
Yes, sir.
Right? So if I refresh the page, what are you expecting?
Yes, sir. Because cricket is not there.
Cricket is not there. But if I change this text to cricket,
Yes, sir.
what do you expect?
Cricket is not allowed.
If there is cricket, for example, in this string, in the first one, right? Now the response will have cricket, and it states cricket is not allowed. Got
Yes,
it?
sir.
So you can check values within the response or whatever. All this is possible because of multiple listeners for the same event, response event, right? Okay, but maybe there are 10 events listeners for an event, right? So still all of them will run. At the moment, all of them will run. So if you remember in the dispatcher, this one, event dispatcher, events, we had used the
Stop propagation.
is propagation stopped, right?
Yes, sir.
This was the method used. So we can check to see if propagation is stopped for a particular event. If that's the thing which should return the loop. So if in dispatcher, if I go to the inside the dispatch method, for each this dot get listeners for event as listener,
Yes.
listener and event, this is being passed to it. Okay, this. So for example, if I can check, or if I dump the event, for example, event, right now, so these are two events right now, both are of type response event, and the is stopped is false.
Yes.
If it becomes true, if the event becomes true,
Yes.
what should we do?
Stop propagation.
Stop propagation.
Stop propagating the fields.
Okay, so rather than here in invalid, where we are changing the response,
Yes,
string
sir.
position this, what can we, because this event is passed to it,
Yes, sir.
what can we do?
We can call the stop propagation method.
Good, very good. So it will be event stop
Yes.
propagation true. How have we set it up? In the event stop propagation,
Yes, sir.
so if we, it should be true, so that the propagation is stopped, right?
Yes, sir.
So we can just call the method here.
Yes.
event stop propagation, and that's it. Okay, now if I refresh the page, because cricket is not allowed,
Yes,
right?
sir.
So did we stop it? We stopped false. Response is this. Okay, I think the problem is the order. We need to change the order of these two listeners. So we are setting the string position of to interest. I have, because this output has interest, this response has interest, so rather than cricket, just let us change it to interest. So if the response has interest, we need to stop this propagation, but it is the second in the row. So if I move this to the first one, this one, header response listener, right? So if the response has interest, so it should stop propagation. And if I refresh the page now, so you can see the second one, it is true in the second listener, because here it has been turned into true, and now in the second one, in the second listener, which is the invalid one, this here the response which it gets is the event is actually true, then the propagation is true. So when this happens, for example, there are 10-20 listeners listening to some event, and if any of them receives an event which is stopped propagation, so it should not be run actually. So let me demo that. For example, in both of the cases, we want to alter the response and we want to add some text with the response. So in the first one, for example, if I need to change the response, get body dot message from first listener, and we'll wrap this in response dot set body, pass it the this. So we are changing the response and we are concatenated with the original response, this message from the first listener, right? So if I refresh it, the first, this is the message from the first listener, right? I will do the same for the second one. This is the second one. So here also we want to change the listener, and it will be from the second listener. So what do you expect if I refresh the page? Two messages have been, this one is coming from the first one and this one is coming from the second one. But what we want to do now is that if the propagation status changes in one listener and the second one receives it and it is true, the second one should not run.
Yes, sir.
This should not run. It means this second message will not be output. So where to make this change? That's why we had implemented in the event. If we go here, we had implemented is propagation stopped function, and it returns the status of it. So if we have stopped it,
Yes.
it becomes true, right? So we are going to make, if I go to the first listener, this header one, if the string position contains interest, we are stopping it, means we are making it true. So in the dispatcher, event dispatcher, where we are looping through all the listeners, events and listeners, so here we can make if event, because it is passed to it, event is propagation stopped. If this is true, So we should break the loop. It means the further loops should not run.
Parenthesis. Is propagation stop parenthesis?
Yeah, thank you, because this is a method. So the first time it will be run, the first listener will be run, but the second time it will check the status of the propagation, and if it is true, it will break the loop, and the rest of the listeners will not be run. So even if there are 100 listeners to a particular event, only the first one will run.
Yes.
So now only the first one, it breaks the change. Even if this happens in the center of the listeners list, so the before the propagation is made true, stopping is true, it will run up to that point, and then the remaining will not run.
Yes.
Got it?
Yes.
Okay, so that's how you add events to particular instances in your application, right? So let me just quickly recap what we did. We created the listeners for response event, and where did we use the response event? Inside the kernel class, just before we are returning the response. Here we had to use the event dispatcher to dispatch the response event, right? To dispatch the response event. Okay, now let me give you one more example of, because we have set up a very powerful system at the moment. And for example, if you remember, we were adding students. So if I go to the controller, entity controller, where the students are added, this is the code. If everything is successful, I want to send an email, for example. Any email I want to send, but where should? Here. So rather than, for example, this is your framework original code, you don't want to change it.
Yes.
You can easily write the mail function here and send the email, but you will be adding code to the framework code. This is not the way out. So here what we can do is we need to
Make a listener for that.
we need to create an event, and with the dispatcher's help create that, dispatch that. So then we can add listeners to it. So what steps are involved? First we will create a new event, which is this is event.
Yes.
So we will create a new event, and we will call it student add.php, for example, right? Let me quickly copy some code from the student event.php, because it implements the event and all that. So student add.php, we'll call it student add, and this is a quiz again for you. What should be inside? Okay, this is just a constructor, right? So in it we can pass something. For now we will leave it like this. So this is an event, student add extends what? Event, right? We don't need to change anything else. But in the constructor we can have the entity class or anything, but right now I will leave it as it is. This is just an event. Okay, now what's the second step? To display to write listeners for it. To write listeners for it. So the second step is to write listeners for it. So inside the listeners we'll call student add listener.php, right? Student add listener.php. Here we will namespace it to app/listeners, and the name of the method is class student listener, like this. Okay, what should it have?
TE. Remove E.
Maybe student add listener. Okay, student add listener, right? What should be the method in the listener?
Send mail.
What should be the method? Public function underscore invoke. Okay, and what should be passed to the invoke method?
Event.
Which event?
The
Because this is student add listener, so it will be student.
Student event.
Yes, so student add event should be passed to it. Okay, student add and $sign event. So this is student add has already been added for us by the editor. Is this clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so here we can do anything with the event. Here event is available now,
Yes, sir.
and but right now what we need to do is we just need to send an email, a dummy email. Okay, to is if you hover over the mail function, the first is to subject and message, right?
Message, yes, sir.
So the two is dummy at truepark.com. The subject is new student added, and the body should be this is going to be an information for you that a student has been added, right?
Yes, sir.
So this is the function for
Semicolon.
okay. The student add listener has invoke method, magic method, and we are just running the mail. This is just for the an example that we can add listeners to the add event. Okay, now how to fire this student add event? We have created the event student add, which is just a dummy event right now.
Yes.
It has no information at the moment, but how to fire it in the code? If I go to the entity controller, here I need to fire it, right? So how to fire an event? I told you in JavaScript you do clicks, for example, but here you have to do something else. So what that firing is? Dispatcher.
Display.
You have to use the dispatcher. So do we have dispatcher available here in entity controller? Do you think we have available? I think in controllers we should have dispatchers, right? If in case we need the dispatcher class. So how can we know?
Inside the constructor, we have to initialize it.
So entity controller, if you remember, extends base controller.
Yes.
Okay, and here we have no dispatcher. So what we can do is we can quickly create a property event dispatcher. Here it is, protected event dispatcher event dispatcher. So what it will be, this is a property, and event dispatcher it has already been included. Okay, we should have a setter method, and where we will be calling it, do you remember?
Set the entity control.
Set dispatcher, and it should be dispatcher
Event dispatcher.
event dispatcher $sign event dispatcher, and this dot dispatcher is equal to event dispatcher. Is this clear?
Yes.
And it should be event dispatcher also, set event dispatcher. Now do you remember in the dispatcher class, which is now the kernel, we had used these methods, set quick, set viewer, set response.
Yes.
So the same we will go to there and call this method set event dispatcher on the controller.
Kernel.
So where is kernel?
Inside the framework.
This is okay. Here if we come to the handle method, this is the handle method. Here we can call just like this, controller pick somewhere here. So controller add
Set event dispatcher.
set event dispatcher,
Yes.
and because we are already passing event dispatcher to the constructor, this is event dispatcher, so it should be dollar sign this dot
event dispatcher.
event dispatcher.
Yes.
Is this clear? Now the controller has access to the dispatcher via this method, right? So if we come to the entity controller now, so here the code where the student gets added, here we need to dispatch that event. Which event? The student event.
Yes, sir.
So this dot dispatcher, because we have event dispatcher now,
Yes, sir.
and then dispatch. What to dispatch? New student event, student add event,
Student add listener.
add, right? And it can have some parameters passed, just like we passed response and request in the response event. Right now we are doing nothing, so ideally we should have this is clear.
Yes.
So this dot event dispatcher dispatch new student. In JavaScript we will have to click something, but in PHP, in this scenario, you will have to dispatch an event so that listeners can know that this event has been dispatched and I can now listen to it, right? Okay, so this has been dispatched. Now one more step we need to do. What? We also need to have this in the class. So student add, yes, it is already there. Okay, so the event is emitting from here, right? Now we have to know, let the program know that this event should have these listeners. So where was it happening previously? In the index.php.
Yes.
If you remember, index.php, where is
Public.
it? Here. So in the index.php we are using these add event listeners,
Yes, sir.
right? So we can chain, or maybe
Add it inside the array.
yeah, so add, so this again will return, we can use this again, add event, add listener, and here the name of the class should now be which class? Student add colon class. And what should be the listener for it? We have created a listener also, student add listener, this.
Yes.
But should it be class or new?
New.
Good.
Object.
Well done. Okay, student add is not here, so what we can do is
Use it.
you can use student add, right? So now we have told our event system that this event should have this listener,
Yes.
and we can add more listeners also to this event.
Yes.
So what we have saved ourselves from, if you go to the entity controller, here we have just used this, and the rest all of the code will be if we have to do something here, once the student is added, in the listeners only. No further code should be added to this.
Yes.
So as a programmer, if you are building a module or a framework, so you should have such events so that users can listen to those events, right? To customize the code. Now let me try. And if you remember, we had a mailing system in DDEV. By default, mail
Yes, sir,
DDEV describe.
Mailpit.
So this is Mailpit. You can test your local emails through it, because your site should not be live. So if I just open this URL, these are older testing emails, so maybe I just click on any either of these. Okay, there is no inbox now, emails in the inbox now. If I submit this test and add student, okay, it has been added just because of the header information right now. But if I go to the mail page, and you can see in the inbox there is one email, right?
Yes, sir.
And this email is, that's the same email which we just fired.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so for example, this email goes to the person,
Email.
the person who submitted the record. For example, the student who submitted his own record, for example,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Because this there is an email field here. This, where is it? There is an email. So if I submit it, it should go to this email,
This email.
right?
Yes.
But also to the admin of the site, for example. So what should I do? I should create another listener.
Yes.
So it will then fire two emails, one to the admin and one to the user, right?
Yes.
Okay, one thing you haven't asked, and if you remember, here we are not passing anything to the
Yes, sir. Student. Right?
student. But if I pass this to it, what does this mean?
The objects.
This entity controller object.
Yes.
Okay, so this means this entity controller object, and in the event, just like we passed request and response to the response event. So because we are firing this event in the entity controller, so why not to pass the whole entity into it?
Yes.
Okay, so in the event, where it is, this one, student add event. Now what should be here?
It should have
Entity controller and dollar sign entity, you can call it entity. Okay,
Yes.
and entity controller should be added here. So what does this mean? Now your event has access to the entity,
All the entities.
all the entity,
Yes.
right? So if it has access to this, the entity controller, this is the add event here, the event is passed to this. Okay, so what does this mean? If I dump dollar sign event in the this, if I dump it, what do you expect? The whole entity
Yes, sir.
object.
All the entities.
So if you remember, in one of the classes we had used entity classes for data. If you extract from PDO an object, so all the entities can have, for example, there are 10 columns in the database table, so there will be 10 properties. We already have studied ID, name,
Yes, sir.
description,
Exactly.
something like this. So for example, if I have to get the description, so I will just get description for it,
Yes.
the entity get description. Is this clear? So for example, if I had those methods, we have not implemented those get methods for description or ID or all that, so we can basically make these values dynamic by getting those values. This is the subject, and this, for example, this is just a dummy, so description or interest can be emailed.
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
so the access to entity can be available in the, let me do it if we can get something from this. So I will submit this again. The student add extends event, and we are passing entity controller into the as entity, but it should be some private property like this.
Yes.
Okay, So we have made it a property of this. So if I refresh the page now, let me do it again once more. So now you can see the entity is available.
Yes, sir.
Entity is available because this is on the event we have made the entity available as a property.
Yes.
And it has all the, even the columns are available here, name, father name, this.
Yes.
So I will leave it to you. In the entity object, if you have, for example, name, father name, email, these are the 4 fields, right?
Yes.
Rather, let me just quickly do it for you. So how can we get the interest value from the
columns
from the
and then
entity?
interest.
So let me go to, do you remember we had the student controller?
Yes.
In the controller student, that's the advantage of it. Okay, these were, so here I will just, for now, public function get interest, right? So what should it return? Public function get interest, return this dot
Columns.
this dot interest. For now let it be interest. We haven't set it up at the moment. You can refer to previous classes where we had all this set up, but here if we have a property,
Why not from the columns array?
yeah, but these are just names of columns, not the value. So here we will create a variable private, the name of the variable should be interest. For now let it be empty array, empty string, and it should be a string. Okay, get interest. Okay, if I refresh the page, this page, sorry, now this is the entity, so it has the interest as an empty value.
Yes.
And it should have a method of
Get interest.
where it is, where I can't see it, get interest.
It's not there.
Function get interest.
Return itself.
No, the function is not. Okay, let us try. I think the dump is not showing it, but this must be working. We'll try it in a while. And rather than setting up the interest here as so if you remember, we have in the entity controllers we have request already available, and let me just show you the code what I want to do. So if we come to entity controller, and you can see if everything is fine, result, it means the record has been submitted. So it means the post interest should be a valid string, and we already have the request post available. So what we can do is in this student.php get interest, this method we should change it to this dot request and post, this just to demonstrate you something. Okay, and this is interest, right? So it should return interest. Now if I go to the student add listener, here the event should have the property of entity, which is it has, and then we can get the get interest, but it is not visible at the moment for some reasons, but interest like this. And if I go to student add, let me just check, this is public, student add entity, student add event, I mean this. So yes, this property should be public so that we can access it inside the student add listener here. Okay, if I dump it, let me just check if it is working. So if I submit it, the enter should be hockey, cricket, so on. And if I submit it, so yes, we are able to get the interest. So this value is available where? In the listener for the student add event. This is very interesting, and this actually I wanted to make a point. So if I go back to student add listener, here we have, you can assign it to a variable, interest equals this, right? Similarly, email equals what? Event dot entity get emails. If we make a get email, let us quickly create this method also, get email, right? And then in the email, so this will be the mail, the first one, so it will become dynamic. Mail, email, subject will be this, and this is going to be the body, so the body should be interest. Let us quickly create this get email method also. So where have I will have to go to the student controller, and I will just quickly get email, and it should return this dot request the post dot email, right? Now if I submit the form, hopefully whatever is the value of the email, so it will be all dynamic. Similarly the interest. So let me try if we get the same email. I'll go to student/new, here email is this, and interest are test cricket and no fake kings in cricket, right? And I will just send the student. Okay, if I come to the email, we have we have 11 inboxes. So you can see the top one is Azmat NVM and no cricket, no fake kings in cricket. So I think we have again developed a powerful system, and in Drupal you will have to do this in your daily jobs. You will hook, these are known as hooks or events. So if a article is submitted, news is submitted, you need to do something, so you will have to hook into the events. So you will already have events available, and you will have to hook into, add just listeners to the events, right? So what we can you can get it. If I go to entity controller again, we are sending emails from here, just this one line of code.
Yes, sir.
Okay, because this is the firing of the event named student add, and then we are listening to this event, and all the logic of the email sending is inside the listeners, not here. If you had to do it here, that would not be okay. So that's the whole phenomena of what event listeners are, right?
Yes, sir.
So now there is one more thing to add, and then we will wrap up the class. That is, if you go to the index.php, we go to, okay, let me go back to the entity controller. What if I give you a task of, when a student is updated, also send an email? What would you do? Afaq, please.
So
First you will add,
listeners to
first you will add the type of event, which is student update,
Yes, sir, exactly.
and then add students to it.
Yes, sir.
But in order to fire the event, you will have to go to the update
Update method.
Method in the controller, edit or update, whatever it was, I don't remember it now. Here,
Sir, update.
so if it is updated here, you will have
Yes,
to
sir.
use the
Listener.
dispatcher
Dispatcher.
and new update, student update. So it will be fired actually from here. Then the listeners will be listening to it, right? So this is a very powerful phenomena. Okay, if I go to index now, this is index. We are polluting the index page with these calls to event dispatcher.
Yes.
Okay, so that's where we need something else. Just like yesterday's class of middlewares, we have to do something. Similarly, we have to provide these mapping from some other file. Okay, and they are known as service providers. What?
Yes, sir.
In frameworks, container is service container. It gives you objects. This is service provider. Okay, it provides input to the functionality of the framework. So let us start creating a service provider first. We will go to in the source. Probably source is the right place here. So here we will create a folder called provider. There can be different types of providers. So this one will be event service provider. Okay, providers. How do we have providers already? Okay, we already have a folder called providers. So here we will create event service provider. Event service provider .php. Okay,
Yes.
event service provider. It should implement an interface, and that interface should be in the framework. So if we come to the framework events, or maybe in the or new folder, create a provider here also, providers. So it should have an interface, service provider .php. Namespace, framework providers, and the interface should be service provider. If we quickly go back to that initial documentation, if you remember, so maybe we have something here.
Listener programs.
Yes. Okay, we can do it ourselves. It should have a method public function register. So this register will actually do all this thing, this mapping which we are doing in the index file. Where is index? In the public. This mapping should be done by the register method. Okay, so in the providers is actually this is just an interface. So the provider we are creating in the source directory here, what should it implement? This is a class. Let us give it a namespace first. So app providers, and the class should be Events, what it implements?
Provide
Service provider.
service interface
Provider interface. And it has included again itself. So what the name of the function is? Register. Register. That's it. Okay. So just like the dispatcher, there are some similarities between the two. In the constructor, we should have the dispatcher available. Okay, so private dispatcher, event dispatcher rather, event dispatcher class. So and the name is event dispatcher, right? It should be available in the constructor, so it means this variable will have the event dispatcher with us. What did it say again?
So use statement, change the use statement.
Service, yes. It's providers.
Framework providers.
Is this okay now? Service provider implements I think this is not saved or what?
So let's check the name.
In the framework, provider is service provider. It is just service provider. Okay. So this provider, and we should have the name with it. Okay, I think we should rename it. Interfaces should have the name of interface so that they are not confusing. So I will go back to the providers, and this is service provider interface.php, and the name should be interface. Okay, everything is fine. Okay, the other stuff we need to is private, and this again should be an array, and it should be listener is equal to an array. Right, it should also be an iterable. Okay, so this register will loop through all the elements here and initialize the class for us, which we are doing with
Inside the index.
in fact we should be using the add listener here, and here you have to list all your class names of the events and their corresponding
Objects.
listeners, right?
So objects of listeners.
So it's going to be something like this. First we will do it for the response event. So response event class. So it should have an array like this, right?
Yes, sir.
The first one should be the name of the, here you don't have to specify the instances, they will be the names. So the first event is, let me recall the names: header, response event listener, and invalid, right? So it should be header response event listener colon class, and the second one will be invalid word colon class. Okay, so if you have, for example, 10 listeners for an event, you will all have to list them here.
Yes.
Right, now the second key should be what? Sorry,
Object of this.
student add, this is one of the
Yes.
event name, right? It should have its own listeners
Yes, sir.
like this, and we will have to add it here also. So where it is, this. Okay, so the key of this will have its own listeners.
Yes.
So right now we have one listener, right, for student add. What it is called? Student add listener.
Yes, sir.
So it will be student add listener colon class, right? And save it. Okay, now the registration we do, it will run the dispatcher for us. This is dispatcher is already available.
Yes.
We will loop through each one of this. The first loop will be what? The event.
Yes, sir.
And then the second one will be its listeners. But the listeners again will have to be looped through, so that we can add listeners to it.
It have 3 loops inside it.
So let me 2 loops for each this dot listeners, right? This dot listeners as key value. So the key will be event event name, and the values will be listeners, because they are more than one. So again this will be an array.
Yes, sir.
Now we will have to re-loop through the listeners, right? So for each listeners
As listener.
as $listener, like this, right? So it means now we are inside these two, this and this.
Yes, sir.
So if you remember how we have initialized the the add event in the index, let me go to the index page,
Add listeners.
add listeners.
We have to
So
call
we
add
have
listeners.
the dispatcher class and then add listener.
Yes, sir.
So the first argument is the name of the class,
Yes, sir.
event, and the second one is the
object.
the new of the
Yes, sir.
object, right?
Listener object.
So here
Provide.
providers, this one. So the first one should be this event name,
Yes.
right? So
Add listener.
and we already have the dispatcher available here as event dispatcher.
Yes.
So how to access it? This dot
Understand this.
dot event dispatcher,
and
and it
listener.
has add listener,
Yes, sir.
right? And the first one should be the name of the event, this one. So event name. The second one will be
Listener.
new listener, because we have to new this class now.
Okay, sir.
New $listener, like this, right? And stop. So for example, you have any number of events or whatever in your application. So basically you will have to do this so that it can be done, provided to the system. So event service provider is now a class, and as I said today, that if you have a class, you need to initialize it somewhere.
Okay.
Okay, only then can that class. So we now need to initialize the class and then run the register method on
Yes,
it.
sir.
Okay, so the way we can do is we will create a bootstrap.php file. From where we can do it, maybe in here we can create a folder called bootstrap. Bootstrap means to start something. So
Yes.
all applications normally have bootstrap related. The files in bootstrap.inc or .php, they have basically initialization type of or such providers. So we can create a new file here, bootstrap.php, right? Here we can call the
Service provider.
service provider, this class. So we will first create an array and call it what? Providers. So this is just the event service provider. There can be multiple service providers in an application. Once you are into Drupal, you will know, or into Symfony, there are a lot of different types of providers.
Okay.
This one is event service provider, right? So event service provider colon class. This is the first one.
Yes, sir.
So for example, there is database service provider, or maybe a lot of other service providers, so you will have to list all of those here, right? But right now we have just one. Next step is to loop through it, because there can be more than one types of providers. So for each providers as provider, right?
Yes, sir.
Because this is getting included in what? In
Index. Yes.
in index page, and their container is available.
Yes, sir.
So what we can do is $container get provider provider object equals this. Is this okay? And then what should we call? This is your test.
Register function.
Good. Provider object and
Register.
call the register function like this. Is it okay now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now if we go to the index page, and this code now is all redundant, this one,
Yes, sir.
we will remove it, or maybe for now just comment it, and then just like we are including these files and the container, so after the container is included, maybe here we can use require base path and column bootstrap slash strap dot php, right?
Yes.
Okay, so one thing I need to check. Let me refresh the page. bootstrap. There is some typo, so it's bootstrap. In index online 58.
Use it.
Event dispatcher, sorry, we needed to pass event dispatcher to it, right? and I
So
commented
you have
that.
commented.
Where was it? Maybe we have deleted a lot of extra code. Control Z. Okay, this event dispatcher needs to be there because it has to be passed to the
Yes, sir.
kernel. And here we will include require base path dot bootstrap slash bootstrap dot php. Now let us check what will happen. Array key. Okay, this is, we should go to some page 20/view, and that's one of the reason we'll cover this. This is good that we are getting this array. Why are there so many messages?
Yes, sir. We are
Why?
not removing the flash message.
Yeah, we are not emptying the flash array,
Yes, sir.
and because now they have been viewed, so this will be okay. How to test if our code is running fine now? Because we have implemented the
Sir, we add new.
So we'll go to new. Let us check if this, probably we are not seeing any output, so it may not be working fine. So let us debug it. I'll go to index.php where this class is event dispatcher. If we debug, let me debug the initialized key in container. So container initialized. So if this event dispatcher has been initialized for us, the key will be there. So let's try. We do have the event service provider key, but not the, it means there is something wrong with the initialized array inside services.php, or container.php. We go to container.php. It's inside the framework here, and check this is the initialized array, and it will at any time have all the initialized objects for us. So if I go to, I think we have missed this thing. I don't know how I have. If constructor of a class is empty, so we are directly returning the class and not assigning it to the initialized array like we have for the rest of the classes here. Let me confirm if the class get dispatcher has the event dispatcher has no constructor. So yes, we don't have any constructor for the event dispatcher. It means probably that's the problem. So let me add quickly class without constructor equals new class, and then return this. But before returning, we should assign this to this dot initialized. It's an array, so the class should be the key and the value should be this class object. Hopefully it will resolve the issue. If I now refresh the page and just to see if this array has the value for event dispatcher. Interesting. Now we have the value for this. Even the env reader was missing. Good that we fixed this bug in our container, and hopefully the issue would have been resolved. And yes, we can now see the text appended with the output. Let us also try adding a new user, so user new, email is maybe this, and if I go to the mail, yes, there is a pop-up for message, so the events are now working fine. So let us quickly recap what change we made with the service provider. So we have now a folder called providers, event service providers. Here we created the class for event service provider. It will have all the keys for the events and then its corresponding listeners. And in the bootstrap.php, we are looping through it and registering the, this basically will add listeners to the event dispatcher class. That's all for today. We have a very small lecture left, which will be the last one, in which we will make plenty of improvements to the application. So see you in that lecture. Thank you.